Doug Ford just gave Mark Carney political advice that could flip the entire Canadian electoral map, and he did it behind closed doors. I'm going to tell you exactly what was said, why it matters, and what it means for every Canadian watching this right now. We are right in the middle of something that feels like a political chess match playing out in real time. The Globe and Mail dropped a bombshell this week, citing 3 separate sources who confirmed that Ontario Premier Doug Ford, a conservative, by the way, privately advised Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney to call a snap election. Not once, multiple times, in person and over the phone. And the most explosive conversation happened at the First Minister's meeting in Ottawa on January 29th, where Canada's 13 premiers sat in a room together with the Prime Minister. Now, here's what I want you to understand before anything else. Doug Ford is not a Liberal. He has never endorsed the federal Liberals. He ran his own provincial campaign last year on a Team Canada platform, won a 3rd consecutive majority government, and he did it specifically by saying Ontario needed a strong mandate to deal with Donald Trump. Sound familiar? Because that's almost word for word the argument he apparently made to Mark Carney. But here's where it gets complicated. Ford was asked directly by reporters whether he gave Carney advice about calling an election. His answer was classic Doug Ford, technically a non-denial denial. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't divulge our conversations, but when you get 13 premiers in a room, politics comes up. And then he smiled. And then he said, I called my election. I'm good. That's as close to a wink as Doug Ford has ever given in public. And then, wait, it gets better. When a reporter asked Ford whether he'd given any advice to conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, Ford laughed and said he congratulated him on winning his leadership review, an 87.4% result at a convention in Calgary. Ford's exact words, you don't win elections at conventions, you win elections across the country. He said it with a grin. The reporters were laughing. Nobody missed what he meant. So let's set the stage here. Ford is openly, publicly, through the cracks of every answer he gives, signaling that he has no faith in Poilievre. And he's having private conversations with the Liberal Prime Minister about calling one. Now, is that political betrayal? Is it strategic pragmatism? Or is it something smarter than either of those? Here's what I think, and I want to walk you through it step by step. Ford and Carney have built what can only be described as an unlikely governing partnership over the last year. They appeared together at the Darlington Energy Complex. They met one-on-one multiple times. Ford even says publicly that he doesn't care about political stripes. He'll work with whoever is best for Ontario. But this goes deeper than a working relationship. Ford won a majority last year by running against Trump and running for Canada. Carney is now 29 percentage points ahead of Poover as preferred prime minister in the polls. Those two facts are directly connected. And then this happened. Carney released his new national auto strategy, a $2.3 billion program, hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs on the line, and a plan so carefully constructed that even Doug Ford, who initially went ballistic over Chinese EV discussions, is now standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister, calling it a win for Ontario. How did that happen, and what does it tell us about whether there's actually an election coming? That's what I'm going to break down for you. Because the auto strategy isn't just economic policy. It's the political foundation of everything that happens next. Let me tell you something that almost nobody in the political press has actually explained properly. And I think when you understand it, you'll understand exactly why Doug Ford went from being furious about this auto plan to being one of its biggest champions almost overnight. Here's the headline version that's been circulating. Canada dropped the EV mandate, brought back a $5,000 rebate, and it's a big win for consumers. That's about 15% of the actual story. Here's the real story. Carney announced a 5-year, $2.3 billion EV affordability program. The rebate is up to $5,000 for battery electric vehicles and up to $2,500 for plug-in hybrids. But the rebate comes with specific conditions that most people haven't been talking about. First, the vehicle has to be priced under $50,000, but only if it's built by a country that Canada has a free trade agreement with. Second, that $50,000 cap does not apply to Canadian-made EVs and hybrids. Those get the full rebate regardless of price. Now, here's what that actually means in practice, and this is the part that kept me up last night. If you want to buy a $120,000 Tesla made in the United States, no rebate. A Ford Lightning or a Hummer EV at $70,000 plus, no rebate. An EV imported from China where we don't have a free trade agreement, no rebate. But here's what's interesting. A vehicle made in Mexico where we do have a free trade agreement priced under $50,000 that qualifies, and a vehicle actually manufactured on Canadian soil, no price cap, full rebate, no questions asked. And then this happened. While all of this was being announced, reports surfaced that the U.S. president is actively weighing whether to pull out of the USMCA entirely. If the United States exits that agreement, suddenly there's no free trade deal with America either, which means American-built EVs would also lose eligibility for the rebate. The economic illiterate decision-making coming out of Washington right now is essentially creating an incentive structure that punishes U.S.-made cars and rewards Canadian manufacturing, not because Carney designed it that way as a punitive measure, but because the conditions Trump is creating are pushing the market in exactly that direction. But that's not even the real story. Canada recently reached a separate agreement with China to allow up to 49,000 Chinese EVs to enter the Canadian market each year at a significantly reduced tariff rate, 6.1%. Instead of 100%. At least half of those vehicles must be priced under $35,000. Now, the rebate doesn't apply to Chinese-made cars because there's no free trade agreement. But here's the long play. If a company like BYD, which is already the world's largest EV seller, which already built electric buses for the Toronto Transit Commission at a plant in Newmarket, Ontario, if BYD looks at this market and says there are 49,000 units of demand, the rebate applies if we manufacture there, and the Canadian government is actively offering investment incentives for EV manufacturers. What does BYD do? What we're learning is that BYD's new market plant only closed after Canada imposed those 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Before that, they were building vehicles on Canadian soil. The plant assembled TTC electric buses. Then the tariffs went up, demand dried up, and BYD shut the doors. But the buildings are still there. The infrastructure still exists, and now the door is being reopened, not just slightly, but with a government program specifically designed to reward anyone who manufactures on Canadian soil with unlimited rebate eligibility. This is the part Doug Ford finally understood when Carney walked him through it in their one-on-one. Ford's initial reaction to Chinese EV discussions was typical, Doug. Loud, protective of Ontario auto workers, deeply skeptical. But once the details of this program were explained, the calculus shifted. If a Chinese automaker sets up shop in Ontario and starts building EVs for under $50,000 with full rebate eligibility, that's jobs. That's investment. That's exactly what Ford has been demanding since the moment Trump started threatening Canadian manufacturing. And right now, with U.S. auto tariffs at 25% on non-U.S. content in Canadian-made vehicles, and with traditional American automakers under pressure, Canada needs new manufacturing partners. The strategy isn't buy Chinese EVs. The strategy is give anyone with the capacity to build affordable EVs a reason to build them here. Now, wait, it gets worse for Pew. Here's something that should be making a lot of people in conservative circles extremely uncomfortable right now. The official conservative response to Carney's auto strategy was to call it insulting. Their shadow ministers released a statement saying the rebate would help American EV producers. They specifically mentioned the Jeep Compass, which they said should have been built in Canada. And they're not wrong that there are legitimate questions about how the rebate structure plays out in practice. But here's the strategic problem. The conservatives are currently also blocking 6 separate pieces of legislation in the House that deal with bail reform, sentencing for extortion, and organized crime. At the same time that Pierre Pouve is positioning himself as the party of crime and public safety, liberals are soft on crime. Vote for us. His own party is the reason those bills aren't passing. Carney used the word obstruction in question, period. And he used it deliberately. Sources are now confirming that the government has been using that word strategically, methodically, because it sets up a specific political narrative. The conservatives are blocking progress. The minority parliament can't function, and Canadians need to decide. But here's where it gets complicated. Carney has publicly said he is not planning to call a snap election. His office repeated that assertion multiple times this week. And yet, Elections Canada has reportedly ordered 700,000 poll tally sheets. Conservatives are accelerating their nominations processes. MPs across the country are reportedly scouting campaign office space. All the infrastructure of an election campaign is being quietly assembled. Even as the official message is no election planned, the betting markets tell a similar story. The probability of a Canadian federal election being called before June 30th has jumped from roughly 8% in mid-January to over 40%. That's not noise. That's a signal. And here's what I want you to sit with for a second. The last federal election was on April 28th, 2025. That was less than 10 months ago. Calling another election within a year would require Carney to make a credible public case for why it's necessary. And that case is being built right now, piece by piece, through every question period exchange where the word obstruction is used. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Doug Ford called his own provincial election early last year. He said Ontario needed a majority government to face Trump with a unified front. He won decisively, and now he is having private conversations with the Liberal Prime Minister, telling him the country needs the stability of a majority mandate. Ford's numbers are still strong provincially. His political judgment on majority mandates has been proven correct, and he has absolutely nothing to gain from a federal Conservative victory that would put Pierre Poilievre in a stronger negotiating position against Ontario's interests. Think about that. Ford's interests align more closely with a Carn majority, a Liberal he can work with, than with a pale government that might pull federal resources away from Ontario and pursue a political agenda that directly conflicts with Ford's own track record in office. The two men are now, by all accounts, genuine political allies, not because they share ideology, because they share a threat. And that threat is economic instability driven by Washington. Here's what nobody's talking about at a loud enough volume. Carney holds a 2-9-point lead over Poilievre as preferred prime minister. The Liberals lead the Conservatives by 4 to 9 percentage points in national polling. Those are not close numbers. Those are the numbers of a party that believes it can win a majority. And that is calculating whether now is the best time to try. The auto strategy was the first piece of the puzzle. The obstruction narrative is the second. Ford's private endorsement of the idea is the third, and Elections Canada preparing materials is the fourth. But here's the question. None of this answers yet. I've laid out the evidence. I've walked you through the auto strategy, the backroom conversations, the political math, and the obstruction narrative being built brick by brick inside the House of Commons. Now, let me give you my honest read on where this is all going. And I want to be upfront with you about where I'm confident and where I'm genuinely still working it out. Here's what I think is actually happening inside the Carney government right now. Carney is not a career politician. He was a central banker for over a decade, Bank of Canada, then Bank of England. He spent his professional life thinking in terms of risk management, probability distributions, and strategic positioning under uncertainty. That mindset doesn't disappear when you walk into RTO Cottage. And the fundamental structural problem he faces as prime minister is this. He has a minority government. He is 2 seats shy of a majority. Every single major piece of legislation he wants to pass depends on opposition, cooperation, opposition, abstention, or some version of both. And the Conservatives have demonstrated repeatedly, deliberately, that their political interest lies in making this government look paralyzed and ineffective. But here's where it gets complicated. The Conservatives are playing a double game right now, and it's becoming increasingly visible. On one hand, Quiver's team has made overtures about cooperation on bail reform, on crime legislation, on economic bills. On the other hand, sources confirm that 6 separate pieces of legislation dealing with precisely those issues are currently being delayed in the House. The government's use of the word obstruction in question period isn't accidental. It's being deployed with surgical precision. Every time a conservative MP stands up and demands tougher action on crime, Carney's team fires back with, your party is blocking the 6 bills that would do exactly that. It's a political trap. And Poole walked into it. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes the whole picture. The auto strategy was designed from the ground up to be politically bulletproof. Get Doug Ford on board, get the auto sector unions on board, get Tier 1 and Tier 2 manufacturers on board. Get environmentalists at least partially on board. Announce it at an auto parts plant in Woodbridge, Ontario, right in the heart of the industrial corridor that decides elections in this country. That's not an accident. That's not optics for the sake of optics. That's a government that is actively constructing the narrative of a future election campaign. We built a strategy. We brought Team Canada together. We protected 500,000 jobs. And the other guys called it insulting. I keep coming back to something about the timing of all of this. The auto strategy dropped on February 5th. The Globe and Mail story about Ford privately urging Carney to call an election dropped days later. Elections Canada is reportedly sitting on hundreds of thousands of poll tally sheets. Conservatives are quietly accelerating their nomination processes across key ridings. MPs are reportedly scouting campaign office space. None of these things happen in isolation. All of them happening at the same time. That's a signal. And here's what nobody is saying loudly enough. Carney's personal polling numbers are extraordinary for this moment in Canadian political history. He is running 29 points ahead of PVE as preferred prime minister, 29 points. The Liberals hold a lead of between 4 and 9 percentage points in National Party support across every major polling firm. Those are majority government numbers, not guaranteed. Nothing in a first past the post system is. But those are the kinds of numbers that make a party strategist lean back in their chairs and start doing riding level math very, very carefully. The last federal election was April 28th, 2025, less than 10 months ago. That's a real constraint. Calling a snap election within a year of the last one carries a political cost. It looks opportunistic. It gives the opposition a clean line of attack. They just had an election. They're wasting your money because the polls look good. This is about power, not principle. Carney's team knows that, which is why the obstruction narrative is so important. The only credible justification for going back to voters this quickly is to say the minority parliament is broken, that the government cannot govern effectively, that the country needs the stability of a clear mandate, especially while navigating the most aggressive trade war in modern Canadian history. This is the part that kept me up last night. Doug Ford's template is sitting right there for Carney to use. Ford called his early Ontario election by framing it entirely around the external threat. He didn't say, I want more power. He said, Ontario needs a unified, stable government to fight Trump. He made the American threat the reason for the election, not political ambition, but national necessity. And it worked. He won a third consecutive majority government. The voters rewarded him for the framing. Carney could run that exact same play at the federal level. And he'd be running it from a position of strength with a popular auto strategy just announced, with Ford publicly standing beside him with Peever's numbers in the basement, and with a daily news cycle dominated by Trump's economic aggression against Canada. The narrative writes itself, but here's where I'm genuinely uncertain, and I want to be honest with you about this. Calling a snap election doesn't guarantee a majority. Canada's electoral geography is complicated. The Liberals came close last April but fell short precisely because they couldn't break through in key suburban Ontario ridings. The 905 belt, the communities just outside Toronto where Ford's provincial machine is strongest. Now, interestingly, Ford's implicit endorsement of Carney, his refusal to endorse Paalev, his public contempt for the "you don't win elections at conventions" line, could move votes in exactly those ridings. Ford's provincial coalition and Carney's federal coalition overlap significantly in that geography, but nothing is guaranteed. Paalev is a skilled campaigner. His base is energized, and if he can successfully reframe a snap election as liberal arrogance, they just had an election, they're doing it again because the polls look good, he might be able to close some of that gap. The conservative ground game in rural Canada and Western Canada remains formidable. What I think the Carney team is actually calculating right now is not whether to call an election. I think they're calculating when. Spring 2026, meaning the next couple of months, has certain advantages. The Trump tariff situation is front and center. The auto strategy is fresh. Carney's personal numbers are at their peak. But a spring election also means less time to build the obstruction case to a point where it fully resonates with voters who are paying close attention. A fall 2026 window gives more time and more legislative failures to point to more opportunities to build the narrative. But it also gives Pulvera more time to recover, rebrand, and close the polling gap. Political fortunes shift. The Trump situation could de-escalate. Carney's numbers could soften. The auto strategy could run into implementation problems. Time is not always the government's friend. Here's what the data tells us, and I think this is actually the most underreported part of this whole story. Holly market, the prediction market that has had a reasonably strong track record on Canadian political events, had the probability of a federal election being called before June 30th at around 8% in mid-January. By the time Ford's private advice to Carney became public, that number had jumped to over 40%. That is not noise. Prediction markets are not perfect, but when a probability quintuples in less than a month, something real is happening underneath the surface. And then there's the Pierre Pulvera question, which I don't think gets discussed with enough honesty. Pulvera won 87.4% at his leadership review in Calgary. That sounds dominant, but the structure of that review matters enormously. It was 2,500 hand-picked conservative members voting in person in Calgary. That's the base. That's his floor, the ceiling. What he can do in a general election in suburban Ontario, in the communities where the auto industry employs hundreds of thousands of people, that's a completely different question. And Ford's dismissal of that number right there in front of reporters with a half smile on his face tells you everything about how Ontario's most powerful conservative premier sees Pulvera's federal prospects. If Carney calls an election and wins a majority, Pulvera loses a second straight federal election to the Liberals. At that point, it becomes very difficult to see a path where he remains as conservative leader. That's not me speculating. That's a reality that conservative strategists are grappling with right now. The stakes of the next election for the Conservative Party's internal politics are enormous. A loss would almost certainly trigger another leadership race. And that dynamic is part of why Ford, now who would prefer a federal conservative partner he can actually work with long term, may privately believe that getting P.A. Vever out of the picture sooner rather than later is in Ontario's interest. That's the layer underneath the layer underneath the layer of what's happening here. So where does this all land for you, for ordinary Canadians watching this unfold? If you're in Ontario, especially in the suburbs, what happens in the next 6 months will directly affect your job security, your cost of living, and the future of the manufacturing sector that tens of thousands of families depend on. The auto strategy is real money. $2.3 billion in consumer incentives, $3 billion in industrial support, $1.5 billion in charging infrastructure. That's not nothing. Whether it works the way Carney says it will depend enormously on whether the government survives long enough to implement it fully. If you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan, you're watching a federal government that already cut the carbon tax, but is now rolling out a Chinese EV deal and tightening emission standards. Your concerns about energy policy, pipelines, and Western alienation remain front and center, no matter who wins the next federal election. And if you're paying attention to Washington, you already understand that everything, the auto strategy, the election speculation, the Ford-Carney dynamic is unfolding under one overarching reality. Canada is navigating a trade war with its largest trading partner. Every political move right now is being made in that shadow. Here's where I land after digging through all of this. I don't believe the election date has been decided yet. What I do see is a carefully staged construction. Phase 1, the auto strategy. Phase 2, the obstruction narrative. Phase 3, Ford's private conversations with Carney, now made public. Together, these signal that even Ontario's most powerful conservative premier sees the need for the government to secure a stronger mandate. Whether this will lead to a spring election, a fall election, or no election at all before 2029 remains uncertain. And the truth is, no one can answer that with absolute certainty right now. What I can say is this: Canadian politics hasn't been this fluid, this unpredictable in decades. The old rules, left versus right, liberal versus conservative, federal versus provincial, simply don't apply the way they used to. That's what makes this moment so critical and so fascinating. So I want to hear from you. After everything we've unpacked, the secret conversations, the auto strategy, the election math, the Pelevra problem, what do you think happens next? Does a snap election come? And if it does Carney secure a majority, or does Pelevra defy expectations and shake up the map?